In 2015, the Anti-Defamation League released a study on anti-Semitism in 100 countries. Of particular importance to us is anti-Semitism in the Islamic world. In Iran, 66% of people felt that Jews were more loyal to Israel than to their host countries. 54% of people felt Jews were responsible for most of the world's wars. In Saudi Arabia, a country which, like Israel, is a US partner in the Middle East, 81% of people believe that people dislike Jews because of how they behave. 69% of Saudis felt that Jews had too much power in the business world. Even in Jordan, a country which has been at peace with Israel for almost 30 years, anti-Semitic attitudes were widespread. 84% of Jordanians believe that people dislike Jews because of how they behave, and 73% believe that Jews exercise too much power over the US government. As we can see, anti-Semitic statements are prevalent in the Muslim world. However, it wasn't always this way. The anti-Semitism coming out of the Islamic world today has primarily been driven by anti-Zionism and opposition to the State of Israel. What were relations between Jews and Muslims like before this? Believe it or not, Jews living in Islamic lands enjoyed a greater degree of freedom and social mobility than their Ashkenazi counterparts in Christian Europe. Jewish culture and intellectual life thrived under Islam. At one point, most of the world's Jewish population lived in the Islamic world. Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews of full or partial ancestry constitute the majority of the Jewish population in Israel. While Ashkenazi Jews still dominate the upper echelons of Israeli society, the Sephardic and Mizrahi communities have left a lasting mark on the country and its history. Mizrahi Jewry can trace its origins as far back as the forced exile of the Jews to Babylonia, now Iraq, in 586 BCE. The Jews of Iraq are one of the oldest diaspora groups within Jewry. As a result of emigration from Iraq to Israel beginning in the 1950s, less than 100 Jews remain in Iraq today. It was also in the 6th century that a Jewish community in Egypt established itself. Other Jewish communities would spring up all around the Mediterranean. At the beginning of the Common Era, most Jews lived in the Roman Empire, but a significant portion still resided in Babylon. By the end of the 8th century, most of the world's Jews would be under Islamic rule. Jews who lived in Rome were influenced by Greco-Roman culture, whereas the Jews of Babylonia created their own way of life independent of Rome. From the 4th to the 10th centuries, Babylonia would emerge as a center of Jewish life. It was here that the Babylonian Talmud, the holiest Jewish text, second only to the Bible, was completed. The history of the Sephardic Jews, or Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, goes back to the exile of the Jews from Judea in 586 BCE according to some legends. At the very least, the Jewish presence in Spain dates back to Roman times. The word Sepharad, the Hebrew word for Spain, referred to a place in the ancient Jewish diaspora mentioned in the Bible. The prophet Obadiah said, "The Jerusalemite exile community of Sepharad shall possess the towns of the Negev." It is believed that Sepharad referred to Sardis in Asia Minor. However, the Aramaic translator of the Bible translated the word Sepharad as Aspamia, which sounded similar to Hispania, the ancient name for the Iberian Peninsula. The Jews of Muslim Spain believed they descended from the Jewish nobles of Jerusalem who were captured and exiled to Rome and Spain in the 1st century CE. These Jews thus concluded that Sepharad meant Spain, and they began calling themselves Sephardim. Beginning in the 6th century CE, Spain's Catholic rulers passed anti-Semitic laws and regulations which made life in Christian Spain unbearable. In 711, the Moors from North Africa conquered the Iberian Peninsula. The Jews of the Iberian Peninsula welcomed the Muslim conquerors as liberators from Christian oppression. Mark R. Cohen writes, "Conventional wisdom has traditionally held that medieval Jews living in the Arab world enjoyed substantially greater security and a higher level of political and cultural integration than Jews living under the cross did." He goes on to say, "In the Arab-Muslim world of the Middle Ages, German Jewish historians found tolerance, acceptance of Jews as peers, and Jewish participation, without abandoning Judaism, in the political and cultural life of the majority society." Be that as it may, the Islamic kingdoms hosting these Jews were still Muslim-dominated societies, and their leaders wanted them to remain so. Of all the Jewish diaspora languages of post-Talmudic times, Judeo-Arabic has the longest recorded history after Hebrew and Aramaic. Judeo-Arabic had the widest geographical diffusion, spreading across 3 continents in medieval times. For the majority of the last 1400 years, Judeo-Arabic was spoken by more Jews than any other language. During the Middle Ages, Arabic was used from Spain to India. Norman A. Stillman writes, Judeo-Arabic words and expressions entered into modern Israeli Hebrew to no less, and perhaps to a greater extent, than Yiddishisms penetrated into American English. The Holocaust, while primarily directed toward Ashkenazi Jews, had an impact on the Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewish communities. About 250,000 Sephardic Jews lived in North Africa. Axis administration over North Africa was different than in Europe, and this was reflected in Nazi policy toward North African Jews. The Europeans had difficulties maintaining control over the indigenous Muslim population. The local Jews shared more similarities with their Muslim neighbors than with their Ashkenazi counterparts in Europe. Henry Abramson says, "It must be clearly pointed out that the North African Jews had the great good fortune of coming under Nazi control only relatively late in the war. Algeria and Morocco were both occupied by Vichy France rather than by the Nazis themselves. While the Vichy French cheerfully sent French Jews to their deaths, they were more hesitant to act against Jews in their colonies since there were more pressing issues for the authorities to deal with." Tunisia was only briefly occupied for 6 months between 1942 to 43. Algeria was home to around 120,000 Jews on the eve of World War II, making up 1.5% of the population. Algeria was ruled as an extension of the French metropole rather than as a colony, thus giving these Jews French citizenship. In June 1940, France surrendered to Nazi Germany, and the pro-Nazi Vichy French regime administered Algeria. In October of that year, the Vichy French enacted the anti-Semitic Statut des Juifs. Jewish property and assets were seized, and Jewish enrollment in higher education was restricted. Algerian Jews were sent to internment camps, and a census of Jews was taken in 1941. Fortunately for the Algerian Jews, the Allied invasion of North Africa in 1942 interrupted their persecution. Unlike the Jews of Algeria, the Jews of Tunisia were not given French citizenship. Approximately 85,000 Jews resided in Tunisia, most of them in Tunis. The French Governor-General dragged his heels in forcing the Statut des Juifs until March 1942. Italian opposition to the Vichy regime's anti-Semitic policies toward Tunisian Jews with Italian citizenship would also work in the Jews' favor. A lack of enthusiastic support among Tunisian Muslims made it difficult for the German forces in the area to enforce their anti-Semitic legislation. In any event, the Allies drove the Axis out of Tunisia in May 1943. In Morocco, the Jews shared a similar experience. Like Tunisia, Morocco was a French protectorate. Therefore, Jews were not granted French citizenship. Still, Moroccan Jews were subject to the Statut des Juifs. Nevertheless, the enforcement of this policy had minimal effect on the daily lives of Moroccan Jewry. Henry Abramson writes, "In other words, Moroccan Jews, in many ways a pre-modern community, were still living in an isolationist manner that made the exclusionist policies of the Statut des Juifs redundant." After Israel declared itself a nation in 1948, a wave of Jewish migrants from other Middle Eastern countries in North Africa flooded Israel. These immigrants were greeted with hostility from the Ashkenazi Jewish establishment. Moroccan Jews constitute the largest group of Mizrahi Jewish immigrants in Israel. Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion said in an interview, "The Moroccan Jew took a lot from the Moroccan Arabs. The culture of Morocco I would not like to have here, and I don't see what contribution present Persians have to make." Mizrahi Jews were viewed as too traditionally Jewish by the European-derived Ashkenazis who saw religiosity as a remnant of the exile. Zion Zohar writes, "As a result, more than any other Oriental Jewish group, Moroccans were frequently the objects of the most racist kinds of disparagement from the Israeli European elite, often because of their tenacity to hold on to their own Arab-influenced customs and traditional religious heritage." Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews face systemic racism and economic exploitation under their new Israeli hosts. Moroccan Jews in Israel were relegated to a permanent underclass, overrepresented in low-wage fields of employment. The Iraqi Jews were the first to respond to and demonstrate against the Israeli government's discriminatory practices. In the 1970s, a new grassroots movement within the Mizrahi community called the Black Panthers came into existence. They organized a series of violent demonstrations, resulting in Prime Minister Golda Meir openly recognizing the social and ethnic rift within Israeli society. The 1977 election of the Likud party's Menachem Begin to the position of Prime Minister signaled a turning point in Ashkenazi-Mizrahi relations. During his victory speech, Begin said, Ashkenazi, Iraqi, Jews, brethren, fighters. Today, the Jews of Islam are primarily concentrated in Israel. Very few Jews remain in the Muslim world. The Jewish community in Israel is split roughly evenly between Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews. In spite of this, Israeli society is still heavily Ashkenazi-centric. The Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews possess a rich culture influenced by a fascinating history. What do you guys think? What impact have the Jews made on the Islamic world? Will Israel elect a Mizrahi or Sephardic prime minister? Will anti-Semitism in the Islamic world wax or wane in the coming years? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.